elective to mandatory, as well as the elimination of the enterprise zone tax credits. We're going to be considering both of these proposals because, frankly, and they aren't new to us at the Rev and Tax Committee and now the Governance and Finance Committee. They present compelling policy questions, tax policy questions, and governance questions. We're going to have the proposals presented to us and by the administration and by the governor's office, and then the LAO will comment, and then we'll have a discussion following that. We have two panels of experts who will give us their approach and their comments, their advice as to the governor's proposals. We'll have two different panels, and we'll deal with one first on the single sales factor, and then we'll have public comment, and then we'll deal with the second on enterprise zones, and again, after that, public comment. If you follow the Rev and Tax Committee over the past years, we've had hearings on, certainly on enterprise zones, and we had a pretty comprehensive hearing last March. So we're going to be approaching both of these this morning. They are extremely expensive. They are critical pieces of the governor's proposed budget. So we need to address those with the seriousness with which the proposals are put forward and the magnitude of the general fund dollars that they represent. So let's begin first with Michael Cohen. Tell us about the governor's proposal.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. Michael Cohen with the Department of Finance, and with me, Jay Chamberlain, the department's tax guru. I was going to start first with enterprise zones and then turn to single sales factor, because I think enterprise zones really follows the discussion we had last week on redevelopment from the administration's perspective, and that is, as we talked about, looking for a new model of economic development at the local level, and that both redevelopment and enterprise zones are really programs designed to move economic development into a particular location. And the evidence, as was the case last week, really questions the net effectiveness from a state perspective, a state tax revenue perspective, of spending hundreds of millions of dollars every year in trying to move economic development that the research shows was likely to occur somewhere and moving it into a particular location. Obviously, at the local level, where development occurs and the planning and the growth associated with those decisions is a very important issue. But from a statewide perspective, the key is really making sure that we have a stable economic environment for which businesses can come to the state, build in the state, regardless of the particular location. As you well know at this point, the administration's proposal is to eliminate the enterprise zone program starting with the 2011 tax year. And in the governor's budget, we've scored a total of $924 million of savings. There's a one-time effect in 2010-11 of $343 million, and then in the upcoming budget year, $581 million of increased revenues. And that 581 really reflects the ongoing impact of eliminating enterprise zones. Just to make a couple of comments to help clarify the proposal. First is, as I mentioned, it's ceasing the program immediately with the 2011 tax year, so that any credits that are on the books that people were hoping to use in 2011 or into the future would not be available. However, if people want to amend their past returns because they do have available credits to use, they would still be able to do so. I'm sure you'll hear later this morning about legal questions regarding such a proposal. Let me just say the administration feels that we're on very solid legal ground in terms of changing the going forward nature of our tax code. We make changes all of the time, and the past legislatures that instituted this program can't bind your legislature or future legislatures. The second main comment that I wanted to make in regarding enterprise zones is, again, I'm sure you'll hear more this morning about how the program can be reformed. And certainly, if we were going to keep the program, yes, there would be changes that could be made to make the program more effective. That's always going to be the case with any government program. But the key is, well, first of all, we need to balance our budget. And so as we've been saying with every solution that people have said, well, I want to offer an alternative to it, we're willing to listen, but the key is getting the same amount of savings that we've proposed, so the $924 million. In addition, as you know, the governor has very much focused on balancing our budget, not just for the upcoming year, but for going forward, and that's that $581 million of ongoing revenues that we would need to replace to the extent that you were looking to maintain the program. Really, it ultimately comes down to us that we're focusing on this budget on those core services, and even within our core services, we're having to make reductions. So it doesn't make sense to the administration to continue this program that's had its effectiveness questioned now for years, and there's been a number of efforts to make changes, make reforms over the years, but still, at best, the program, I think you would have to say it has some success in limited areas, but as a statewide policy has not been successful. Finally, just a note on these type of programs. There is an inherent difficulty in trying to evaluate them. We would acknowledge that. The real question is, you're always comparing to what would have happened absent this program. And so obviously we don't know where economic development would have occurred absent enterprise zones. All we have is the best evidence that's made available that you'll hear more about. The key, of course, is that with enterprise zones, it's taking money that could be spent on another program or could be spent in some other way within the tax code, so that it's not just a matter of, well, there's some net benefit of the enterprise zone program. It's really the lost opportunity of those nearly $600 million a year on to do something more effective. So with that, let me turn to the single sales factor issue, and as your briefing paper points out, this is really an issue that's been around a long time, but what we're reacting to most recently is the 2009 budget package, which basically gave multi-state or multinational businesses a choice about how they wanted to file their taxes. If they wanted to stay with the old three-factor system, sales, payroll, and property, or did they want to move to an apportionment system that relied only on sales? The problem there is multiple. First is that you've basically giving taxpayers a choice, and it's not that they're gaming the system. It's obviously in their long-term best interest to choose the tax preparation method that lowers their tax payments. But from a state perspective, we really should pick what we think is the best apportionment method and require everyone to use that. Furthermore, the way we've set up the system now is for any business that's entirely within the state of California, they don't have the benefit of being able to switch back and forth from year to year. So whereas the change to single sales factor was intended to encourage investment within California, we actually have created this disincentive for California-only companies in terms of our tax policy, and have discouraged investment in California. Going to a mandatory single sales factor, as we're proposing, so basically all businesses that are using these apportionment methods would use sales only, puts California in line with many other states' policies. We eliminate that disincentive to invest in California. And consequently, as part of, again, going back to balancing the budget, we end up with increased revenues of $1.4 billion. That's $468 million in the current fiscal year and $942 million in the upcoming budget year, with about $1 billion of ongoing revenues in the future. And so, obviously, these are tax policies that the legislature has grappled with in recent years, but given the state's budget situation, it gives us an opportunity to revisit those tax policies, figure out which ones make the most sense. And just as we're doing on the spending side of the budget, kind of taking a hard look at all of our spending programs, we think it's appropriate to do the same on the revenue side.
Okay. Jay? No. We don't have Jay Chamber? Pardon? Technical advice only. Yeah. Okay. Got that. Welcome. All right. Let's hear from the LAO, and then if committee has questions, we'll go into that. Otherwise, we'll go to our panels. Okay. So, welcome.
James Knockbauer, LAO. I've got two handouts for you today. Hopefully they've both been distributed. I'll follow Michael and go in the same order. First one is the Enterprise Zone handout. Looks like this. And then I'll be getting to the single sales factor pamphlet we put out last year. I'm going to start with page 4 of the Enterprise Zone handout. How to evaluate program effectiveness. And clearly the Enterprise Zone and related program credits and deductions are used extensively. But use is not the same thing as effectiveness. And to evaluate effectiveness, there's a real need for statistical analysis and for plausible control groups, because we can't easily observe what would have happened in these communities had these programs not been in place. And without statistical analysis, without plausible control groups, there's no way we could begin to answer the important questions the legislature should consider. And these questions are, would more or fewer people have had jobs in the area if the state had used money differently? And would some or many of these jobs for which credits were claimed, were these jobs offset by losses elsewhere? And then finally, did these programs just reward decisions by firms or local government officials?
Excuse me, I'll have to interrupt you.
Sure.
We have a quorum that we need to establish. Please call the roll.
Wall.
Here.
Wall present. Huff.
Here.
Huff present. DeSaulnier. Fuller. Hancock.
Here.
Hancock present. Hernandez.
Here.
Hernandez present. Kehoe. Lamalfa. Lamalfa. Liu.
We do have a quorum. I would like to do the two items of committee business while we can. First of all, we have committee organizational matters in front of us. We have the committee rules. Let's see. Do I have a motion on the committee rules that everyone has had a chance to look through? All right. It's been moved. Please call the roll.
Walk.
Aye.
Walk aye. Huff.
Aye.
Huff aye. DeSaulnier. Fuller. Hancock.
Aye.
Hancock aye. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez aye. Kehoe. Lamalfa.
Aye.
Lamalfa aye. Liu. 5-0.
All right. 5-0. The rules are adopted. We have one more motion to make on committee
Move SB
assistance.
66.
First, we have another motion on the rules, and then I will entertain that. I recommend we need to appoint Marissa Lanchester and Primilda McKenzie as our committee assistants. So I would ask for a motion on that. It's been moved. Please call the roll.
Walk.
Aye.
Walk aye. Huff. Huff aye. DeSaulnier. Fuller. Hancock.
Aye.
Hancock aye. Hernandez.
Aye.
Hernandez aye. Kehoe. Lamalfa. Lamalfa aye. Liu. That's 5-0.
That motion has 5 votes. That is sufficient, but on both the committee rules and the addition and the appointment of our committee assistants, I will hold the roll open. Ms. Fuller, you had your...
I just want to be sure that you got me on the line.
Yes, we will open it shortly. We will reopen that question in a moment. Okay. So those two will remain open, and I will now entertain a motion on the piece of legislation that we heard.
I'll move SB 66.
All right. It has been moved. Please call the roll.
Walk.
The motion is do pass. Aye.
Walk aye. Huff. Huff aye. DeSaulnier. Fuller.
Aye.
Fuller aye. Hancock.
Aye.
Hancock aye. Hernandez. Hernandez, aye. Kehoe. LaMalfa. LaMalfa, aye. Lou. 6-0.
We have 6 votes. Again, that's sufficient to pass. We will leave the roll open for those to add on who are not here. All right. Now then, we will return to Mr. Nachbar.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you. So as I was saying, there is a real need for plausible control groups and statistical analysis to evaluate whether or not enterprise zone programs are working. And our assessment is, following most rigorous research, that enterprise zones have not been found to increase the number of jobs in the targeted areas. And this could be for a variety of reasons, such as firms favoring qualified workers, workers that are qualified to earn them tax credits, over other workers. And even if an enterprise zone did have a positive effect on jobs locally, the incentive might just be moving jobs around the state. So, in our view, well, I should also point out that there is some evidence that some enterprise zones do work better than others, but our bottom line is that we recommend these programs be eliminated. They're expensive and have not been shown to be strongly effective. And finally, the governor's proposal to avoid unused credits does raise some questions. Businesses did make decisions under the assumption that the state would meet its credit commitments. And voiding unused credits not only raises concerns about the state's treatment of those businesses, but it also could weaken incentives provided by other tax credits. And yeah, that's our response on enterprise zones. On the single sales factor, we also agree with the governor's proposal, and would just point out that the existing system of being able to choose annually your tax apportionment formula just went into effect in tax year 2011. So if you move relatively quickly, the disruption may be reduced.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sisney, did you wish to add anything? All right. Are there questions from the committee? Mr. Vice Chair?
Yeah, for anybody can jump in on this. Are there any legal problems with changing the rules for those businesses that have located into enterprise zones for particular tax credits?
Jason Sisney from the analyst's office. Obviously, we're not your attorneys, but I think in general, from what we have seen, we would agree with the administration that you would be on sound legal ground to adopt the governor's proposal. As Mr. Nachbauer pointed out, there are obviously issues with voiding unused credits. Businesses did make decisions based in part on the state's tax policy. But on the other hand, the state changes tax policy regularly when businesses have made decisions based on the existing policy. And so the legislature's power to adjust tax policy is one of its central powers, and it would be, in our judgment, very unlikely that the courts would overturn that decision if the legislature wished to make it. That being said, we think that from a policy perspective, certainly you should consider very carefully the ramifications of the proposal to void the unused credits, because we have a number of tax credit programs which, we often have concerns about whether they're effective. But if businesses don't have confidence that the state is going to stick to a consistent tax credit policy, then it seems that tax credits will be even less effective than they would be otherwise. So I think there's a policy question in our mind more than a legal question.
Any other comments?
Just to add, I think one of the benefits of the governor's approach in terms of the overall budget is to not just think about 1 year at a time. And so in balancing a budget over the 4-year period that we forecast, you can start giving more confidence to residents of the state regarding programs that they benefit from, and taxpayers in terms of the level of taxation that's going to be expected from them, so that we won't have these annual conversations about, well, which program are we going to change? Are we going to change tax rates and so forth? That taking the long-term view on the budget will also give a little bit more confidence to taxpayers that we've taken a long-term view on the state's tax policy.
Okay. I think the policy is a good thing to focus on. It seems at a time right now with the shakiness of the economy, for lack of another term, it seems if you were going to change it, this would be absolutely the worst time to change it, because I think enterprise zones are one of the few things where we actually do give incentives to create jobs, to build something where there's not, to help the unemployment. And yet, it seems like a knee-jerk response of us to change our policy because it's expedient to us, and we can't really prove something. We don't have the right algorithm to demonstrate that it's actually doing what we think it's doing. But I'd certainly hate to find out just the opposite, that, oh my gosh, they were actually doing something when we pull the plug out from them. The one thing I hear most from the business community, they already believe we're regulated to death and taxed to death, but just give us a straight line so we know it's predictable and we can factor it in. And yet this goes to the very opposite of that as well, by luring them into these places and then pulling the rug out from under them once again. So I'm certainly reticent to do anything that would jeopardize one of the few economic incentives we have in the state.
All right. I'd like to welcome Senator De Leon to the dais. Senator De Leon has particular interest in single sales factors, so I'd like to welcome you if you have any comments or questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I very much appreciate the opportunity today, and thank you for the invitation. I got here a little late, so I'm not sure if a discussion has ensued already with regards to the single sales factor as it relates to our budget and to California. Nonetheless, for the record, I want to make it clear that I do believe that an annual, and let me underscore, an annual elective single sales factor is simply just bad tax policy for the state of California, for taxpayers, for our general fund, as well as for businesses that are anchored and organic to the state of California. I do believe it's a massive corporate giveaway for businesses that are rooted and anchored out of the state of California, and provides a perverse incentive, if you will, for corporations that are anchored in the state of California. When it's about job creation and job expansion, it's done elsewhere, in Nevada, it's done in Texas, it's done in Arizona. I don't believe this is a partisan issue. We have individuals, obviously, who believe in the complete elimination of a single sales factor. I'm respectful of that as well. There was an attempt last year, I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Chair, through Proposition 24, if that is the correct number, to eliminate the single sales factor altogether. I believe in a mandatory single sales factor to level out the playing field, to create jobs in California, not elsewhere. Obviously, we have the issue with the general fund, and what would be one of the solutions, I believe, through the LAO, that we have clear data that clearly articulates two main positive factors. With mandatory single sales factor, we'd have the creation of at least 40,000 jobs in California, as well as $1 billion to our general fund that obviously can go to our public schools and elsewhere. So I am looking forward toward this discussion. Madam Chair, I want to thank you for your leadership as well on this issue. Since I've known you, you've been extremely knowledgeable on this issue. I know a lot of folks in California are unaware of what the single sales factor is. I would even venture to say even a lot of members, are unaware that it's actually going to go into effect this year. And the implications are, the magnitude is great as we move forward, and how we deal with hopefully changing this tax policy that is bad for California. So thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Senator. I would like to ask actually both of you, about this issue of how we evaluate whether it's a tax credit, whether it's a single sales factor, whether it's enterprise zones. What's concerned me is that when introducing these tax credits, once they're in, they're really hard to get rid of. There's usually they're just almost in cement. Everybody fights about whether they're effective or not, and it takes 2/3 vote to remove them. So without criteria, or even with criteria, they'd be very difficult to remove. I've sat through plenty of hearings when we talk about enterprise zones, and there is an industry that supports them. There are members who support them. There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that they work here. They may not work there, and usually those arguments are made back and forth. We need some criteria if this program remains going forward. So what I'd like to ask you is, what kinds of criteria would it be a good idea to put into effect that would at least minimize this kind of conversation in the future? And we've had, or this kind of back and forth with no evidence. The manufacturer's investment credit is the only tax credit that I know of in recent memory that actually required a certain amount of jobs to be created at the end of, I believe, a 5-year period. Was it? It was annual, but there was 10 years. And when, at the end of that time, basically, there was no, in fact, California lost manufacturing. So it was clear that that particular policy approach, tax approach, wasn't working. Not that the issue wasn't important to California, but that wasn't the tool. So how do we evaluate going forward this particular tool of enterprise zones so that we can be most effective at encouraging economic development?
You probably can't to any great degree of certainty. I think that social scientists, economists, and others would really favor essentially randomized trials where you, I guess for lack of a better way to put it, would have some parts of the state able to be in enterprise zones and some parts not, and you would compare them. And that seems a very difficult policy for the legislature to put in place, and it would be difficult to measure even then. Tax credits, tax expenditures of this type are just always going to be difficult to prove their effectiveness to the satisfaction of many, because it's always very hard and nearly impossible to know precisely what economic activity would have occurred in the absence of the policy. Probably a better approach in total would be to move in the direction of getting rid of many tax expenditures and tax credits and using the savings to the state to lower the overall tax rate for all businesses, and that would have the advantage of improving California's competitive position with regard to its marginal tax rates. And it would also get the state out of the business of favoring some types of development, some types of businesses, some types of hiring more than others. So I just don't think you're necessarily ever going to find a silver bullet to prove that tax credits are effective.
Suppose, however, that was a thoughtful answer. Suppose, however, you have an enterprise zone that's been in effect for 15 years, and the unemployment in particular sectors actually increased, or some economic indicators actually got worse. I mean, would that be? I mean, that's rough justice, but I mean, something's not working.
Well, that would be a matter of concern. I mean, there could be a variety of reasons for that. It could be that the tax expenditure program made things better than they would have been otherwise. You could be dealing with an industry that is subject to competitive pressures from abroad and from other states, and technology evolves, and that industry's profile changes. Even then, it's very hard to do. But I do agree that if you do see that is something that should be a red flag. One thing that might be valuable with tax expenditure programs is to regularly place a sunset on them. So as imperfect as the evaluative tools are, it would prompt legislative review every few years to consider whether to continue the program. Now, on the other hand, what we were talking about with the governor's proposal to void the unused credits, that makes it that much harder for businesses to make long-term investment decisions based on the credit if they know to a certainty that there's a point where the program will be sunset and may not exist thereafter. So it's a very hard balance to find between encouraging companies to do what you want and on the other hand measuring the effectiveness of this program. It's just very hard to do. And I think in general, that's probably why we point you to the general policy of trying to broaden the base of our taxes and lower their rates overall.
Let's talk about the sunset for a moment, because I know there will be a bill coming forward that does precisely that for new tax expenditures. Do you have a sense of how long businesses really take to make those kinds of forecasting decisions, and whether it's 5 years or 10 years or 7 years? Any sense? And if you don't have to say. Any thoughts?
Well, the different planning horizons of different sectors can vary dramatically, and so there's no single answer to that.
Okay. So from the perspective of, from what you're saying, you believe a sunset would be important, but the planning horizon is really an issue, or not?
You'd want the evaluative period to be long enough that the program might, if it worked, have an effect.
Okay.
But you wouldn't want it so long that it's essentially very, very long-lived.
Okay. Mr. Cohen, do you have any thoughts on that? The criteria for effectiveness, in particular for enterprise zones.
Sure. I mean, I would echo most of Jason's comments that you don't want to be dinging areas for overall economic conditions. Just the same, you don't want to give enterprise zones credit. If the overall economy is booming, you don't want to say, oh, well, these are effective because, look, unemployment went down, when unemployment's maybe going down across the state, or maybe going down completely unrelated to the zone itself. So ultimately, where the administration ends up with is that these type of location decisions just haven't been proven effective from a statewide perspective, and that as part of our rethinking of what's a state responsibility and what's a local responsibility, we would suggest that local governments are much closer to these business decisions. They're going to have a much better sense on an anecdotal basis, is this incentive program being effective in, did it actually change behavior? At a statewide level, we're never going to be able to get much beyond these anecdotal stories about, this zone is effective, and then comparing that to the overall research that suggests, no, they're not very effective. So our emphasis is at the local level, that local governments are going to be much better, in a much better position to be deciding whether to continue incentive programs or not.
Okay. Let me just finish with one question about tax expenditures in general, and this notion of going forward, whether we ought to establish some kind of sunset on them. I know the governor is new, but I'm curious as to whether you have any thoughts on that as a policy going forward.
Well, again, going forward, the administration's policy is to not have these types of programs, but obviously to the extent that there was an agreement to have a program, it makes sense to, both on the spending side and on the revenue side of your budget, to constantly be evaluating that. And if the legislature feels like it needs a time-certain check-in on a program, certainly that can make sense in a lot of areas. We kind of view the annual budget process as also that check-in program. the state's current budget difficulties are making us reassess basically every aspect of the budget, but we're open to moving forward all sorts of different approaches to making sure that continues, that this isn't just a once every Great Recession type event where we're evaluating the effectiveness of state government.
Okay, I appreciate that, and I want to, yes.
I would add that I think that several times in the discussion, be it about enterprise zones, be it about the sales factor, the issue of certainty for businesses and taxpayers has come up, and I think that probably the most important thing that the legislature can do now to provide certainty for businesses and other taxpayers is to balance the budget, to do it in a really hard and honest way that is sustainable over the years, so that we don't have to come back here year after year after year to be discussing how to tweak the tax code to produce more revenue. Coming up with a balanced budget approach, sustainable over a multi-year period, really would go a long way to providing investors and businesses certainty that they need to plan and invest in the state.
Okay, thank you. I have one more thing I want to follow up on the enterprise zone. Sure. Do you have any thoughts about if this continues? What about? Do you think the state ought to make some distinction between local or locally owned, or I'm not sure we can legally, but between locally owned businesses versus members of international or national chains? For example, the way that the zones are drawn, it's a broad net. That's also true for these TEAs. Do you make a distinction? Could you make a distinction? Would it be a good policy to make a distinction between a Starbucks, for example, or a Chevron, and a local business that happens to be in the zone?
Part of what the administration is trying to do is set a level playing field for all businesses, where we're not preferring particular locations or particular industries, and I think it would. That would follow to your question that it's counterproductive to be trying to pick particular businesses that we favor or not. It's much more, and I think the single sales factor fits into this, is pick one approach that all businesses, whether they're homegrown or from someplace else, that there's a set of rules that everybody knows that are going to be stable, and that we move forward from there.
Okay. All right, thank you. Further questions? Any questions from the committee before I move to the panel? All right. Thank you, all four of you, very much. And we'll now move to the first panel. Again, just for the benefit of those in the audience, we will first talk about the single sales factor, and at that point we will have public comment, and then we'll move to the second panel on enterprise zones and public comment after that. I'd like to invite Andrea Jackson, who's the Director of State Governmental Affairs for Genentech, Gene Ross, the Executive Director of the California Budget Project, and for technical assistance only, Carl Joseph, Assistant Chief Counsel from the Franchise Tax Group. Welcome. Ms. Jackson, welcome. We'd like to hear from you first.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Good morning.
First, I'd like to just give a little bit of background about Genentech. In case you don't all know, we're the oldest biotech company in the world, founded in 1976 by a venture capitalist and an academic. And unless you work at Amgen, we're the largest biotech company in the world as well. But if you work at Amgen, they think they're largest. So.
But they're not here, so it's okay.
No, when they're not here, so we're the biggest today. We focus primarily on oncology. We have founded some antibodies and proteins that have changed the way that the medical world has worked. And one of our drugs even is called curative. Doctors won't call it a cure, but it is curative for about 25% of patients who have a particularly aggressive form of breast cancer. And before that was a death sentence, and now it's called curative. So the industry is really advancing the way that we take care of unmet medical needs and treat patients with life-threatening and chronic diseases. We are now owned, as I'm sure most of you know, by Roche. A couple years ago, they took us over, and they are headquartered in Basel, Switzerland. Genentech, however, remains Genentech in the U.S., and we're headquartered in South San Francisco. And one of the things I wanted to clarify today is that Genentech has increased jobs in California every single year since 1976. And we did have some layoffs last year, and we can't always control how people in Basel, Switzerland talk about things worldwide. But in California, I wanted to clarify that we moved the Roche U.S. headquarters from Nutley, New Jersey to California, and with the layoffs and the merger, we had a net job growth in California in 2010 and will so in 2011 as well. We have also continued substantial construction going on in South San Francisco to make way for those folks coming from Nutley. We have several $100 million worth of construction going on down there and anticipate probably a level need for construction at the site in years to come. Genentech has always supported a mandatory single sales factor. From day one in different iterations and in different bills that I've been working on for the last 7 years and the company for the last 10 years. But we've always supported a mandatory single sales factor. And the reason is that it's good tax policy. 25 states now have a single sales factor that's either fully single sales or nearly fully single sales. In New Jersey, there's a bill on the governor's desk. I'm not sure if it's going to get signed or not, but their states continue to move in this direction so that they can compete with one another for jobs and for construction. And it's the way of the tax policy in the country. Only 2 states have an elective single sales factor. Missouri and Virginia has a little odd version of one, but Missouri's is elective. And I think there's a reason for that, because it's not good tax policy. Mandatory single sales factor sets one set of rules for taxpayers that they need to follow. We can't elect which tax policy that we want to choose for our individual tax returns, and it doesn't make sense, I don't think, to have 2 sets of rules for companies who are filing their tax returns as well. Genentech has always taken a principled stance on mandatory single sales factor across the country. We have supported mandatory single sales factor in other states on the record and testifying and helping pass those policies, even when it actually increased our tax liability. And the reason is because we believe in the tax policy, and we should have one set of rules. And we don't believe that we can support mandatory single sales factor in California and then, say, oppose it in Louisiana or Georgia or some other location where it's going to impact us financially. There are some companies that have chosen in this round to oppose this move to mandatory, the suggestion to go to mandatory here in California, while at the same time they're supporting the tax policy either through trade associations or individually in states like New Jersey and New York and Washington. And we just don't think that that's a good way to behave as a company for us. Our policy is to be consistent across the country, and we think that it's disingenuous to support one policy in one state and a different policy in another state. The policy itself, I'm hoping that there's some talk of sunsets and other issues, and I hope that there's not a talk of sunset on single sales factor, hopefully when we get it to mandatory, because it does help us plan for the future. We do 10-year plans as a general rule, and it helps us plan our construction and where we're going to do that. And it encourages California companies to grow and expand in California instead of elsewhere. I'm sure most of you have heard the story about our facility in Oregon, and I know there has been several statements in the past about single sales factor before it was enacted, that tax policy, companies don't make decisions based on tax policy, and for us that just simply is not true. we decided to locate a $400 million facility with 250 jobs in Oregon a few years ago. And the reason was because of the single sales factor policy. The first thing we did is take off every state that didn't have single sales factor. That was the first thing we did in our search. And the decision was about 10% of the cost of the project, based solely on that tax policy. And what the results were are really kind of ironic, is that in Oregon, our revenues didn't change that year. We didn't sell a whole bunch more product. Our revenues remained neutral. But our taxes in Oregon then did not change, but our taxes in California went down because we added property and payroll in a single sales factor state. So the denominator in our 3-factor formula here, or 4-factor formula here in California, became less, and in Oregon it remained the same. So California essentially paid us to build in Oregon, and that's a perverse incentive that I think that we need to make sure that we don't encourage anymore. This policy, what it does is encourages California companies that have more property and payroll in California than elsewhere, to go ahead and expand in California, because it makes good tax policy sense. I know there's a lot of discussion about regulations and other tax issues in California, but for companies who are based here, this is our home, and this is where we would prefer to expand, because we're comfortable here, and we like to stay close to home. Our researchers like to stay close to manufacturing when they can. It's not necessary, but they would prefer to do it. We like to stay within a short plane ride of where things are in case there are problems. And so we would prefer to expand in California if we could. And finally, it's just good for the budget. I mean, we are in crisis. Probably, I don't know if you disagree, but it seems to me like this is going to be the most difficult budget in California's history. And we've said that the last few years, but this year it remains true again. It just continues to get worse. There are no other gimmicks. There's no places to paper over. It's going to be rough. And $1 billion is $1 billion. And if out-of-state companies are uncomfortable with this policy, I would encourage them to build in California so they have a higher footprint here, and then their taxes will even out. But it's a wash for them, though, in the end, because they're getting the benefit of this policy in New York and in New Jersey and in Washington, where they're headquartered. So they're getting the benefit of this policy, and I think California is in a position to be competitive with the other states if we make this mandatory.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. I wanted to let the public know, first I want to thank you for appearing on behalf of Genentech. We did request of 7 other companies and 3 associations to come and address this committee and the public on mandatory single sales factor, and only Genentech agreed, and I appreciate that very much.
Well, we tend to be a little rogue out there, and we're okay with that.
Okay, I like that. Welcome.
Jean Ross.
Jean, you're on.
On the same side for a change.
And I'm about to associate myself with almost all of your remarks in the interest of brevity, which is, I'm pleased to say, taken a long time. Jean Ross, Executive Director of the California Budget Project, thank you for the invitation to appear this morning. And as that interchange might have suggested, we have historically been opposed to single sales factor, either mandatory or elective, but now that you or your predecessors have made the choice to go down the road to single sales factor, we believe that the governor's proposal is an appropriate one for many of the reasons that Ms. Jackson outlined. I'll touch on a couple of others as well. So California is one of only 2 states to have a pure elective single sales factor. Again, as Ms. Jackson said, Missouri being the only other one, which is certainly not a state that has stood out in the past in terms of economic performance. While I think the objective research literature leaves a lot to be desired about the efficacy of single sales factor, period, if you believe the arguments that supporters have made, there is absolutely no reason why you would want to make it elective, and every reason why you wouldn't. I think the best arguments are really laid out in the background packet, some of the materials the legislative analysts prepared. This is one of those things that's hard to wrap your head around, and you need to see somebody work through the mathematical examples, and I think they did a very good job of showing what happens if, in a hypothetical investment decision, California versus Oregon, that now that you have states who will choose to invest out of state specifically for the purpose of lowering their taxes and moving to or staying with the old double-weighted sales formula. In California, one thing that Ms. Jackson didn't mention that I think is particularly concerning under the current system is the ability for companies to game the system, to use single sales in years when they make a lot of profit and want to minimize their taxes to California, and then to flip in years when they have a loss, for whatever reason that loss might be, go on to double-weighted sales and then maximize their losses incurred in California, which then, using NOLs, they can carry forward or carry back to reduce their taxes in California. And I think, again, in the opening panel, there was a lot of talk about the impact on the budget and the desirability of what you would want your tax system to look like more generally. And this is really, I think, a perverse outcome of having an elective system where you can go back and forth based on whether or not you're having a good year or a bad year. It is a loophole that certainly should be closed down. With respect to the portion of the governor's proposal that would put California on a market rule basis for sourcing intangibles, I think from a conceptual and policy framework, if you were going to use sales as the basis of your corporate income tax, having a universal market rule system is consistent with that. So we would argue that that is an important component of the governor's proposal. Last but not least, this is a tough budget. I think we all agree, you agree, and you certainly understand that more than any of us in this room. And I think in the spirit of shared pain, shared sacrifice, when we are looking at extending taxes that fall on individuals, making deep cuts to virtually all areas of the budget, I think the proposals before you today are an important component to show that we're all in this together. Thank you.
All right. I have a couple questions and you're here for technical. Do you have any comments, or did you want to?
I think everything that's been said sounds accurate so far as the law is concerned.
Let me ask you a question, though, since you're here.
Sure.
With regard to the administration of the tax,
yes.
Hopefully your system is easier to, it should be as plainly and easy to administer as possible, your tax system. Does it make any difference from your perspective, whether it's single or mandatory?
Whether there's the election choice versus the one system? Yeah. Well, it certainly is more difficult, I think, to administer two different sets of sales factor rules, which is what we would have to do as the law stands now, because the old rules are still intact for people who do not make the election, and then the new scheme is available for those who do make the election. So essentially now we are in the business of not only administering the rules we've had for a long time, but also a brand new set at the same time, and so there is complexity in that. Now, as to whether or not that's of any additional cost or anything, I don't know. I'm sure that others in FTB would be able to answer that. But from a standpoint of just overall complexity, yeah, it does add to the number of code sections that need to be reviewed, and certainly if you are a taxpayer filing your tax return, you are going to have to understand all of these, the new rules and the old rules, to decide what it is that you find in your best interest every year. That's true.
Okay. I wanted to ask Ms. Jackson, you made a comment, I believe, that tax policy is important to Genentech in terms of location, and you attached a percentage to it. in terms of, and I don't remember what that was.
It was just for the Oregon project, and our folks tagged it at 10% of the project cost going to a single sales factor state versus whether we would have built it in California under the current four-factor formula.
Can I ask you to talk about what the other 90% factors are? I'm curious as to what other things go into that
No,
kind
it
of
wasn't.
decision.
The decision wasn't. It wasn't a 10% decision. The cost of the project was 10% different.
I see.
By going to a single sales factor state, which simply made it. It made the choice that we must go to a single sales factor state because that much of the project cost is a significant amount, enough to overcome any other advantages that a state might have.
But on the Oregon decision, were there other factors as well?
Well, we always, tax policy is our first factor, and then the other decision things are, good infrastructure, access to airports because we have to ship our materials. We want to make sure we have access to a good workforce. We need, depending on the facility, we need access to water. And all of those things are available in any number of states. And so it came down to the deciding factor was tax policy.
Okay. Jean, did you have a comment?
I'm trying to mentally do the math simply because California has an 8.84% corporate tax rate, and so if you had a 0% corporate tax rate in California, and then it's deductible. But I think there is, and I think this is an important issue because it comes down to, I think, one of the questions both in the Enterprise Zone program and this, that when you take into account the fact that corporations can deduct their state income taxes from their federal income taxes, I'm trying to figure out if you had a zero rate in California, that would still only be 8.84%. So any tax net out corporate, you're looking at more like 6%. So it's a math issue, but I think it's an important math issue.
Okay. All right. Does the committee have questions of this panel? Senator De Leon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple comments. I want to thank Ms. Jackson and Ms. Ross for your testimony, for your insight, and for your real-life, real-world experience with regards to single sales factor. A couple comments. One is, for me, and the reason why I support single sales factor that's mandatory is, number one, is job creation, obviously. As I stated earlier, we had the LAO who stated in his report that with a mandatory single sales factor, we have an opportunity to create up to 40,000 jobs. In the climate today where we have been disproportionately impacted by the financial crisis nationwide, we need every job possible in the state of California. So number one, job creation, which is really critical. Number two, I do think it's quite obscene. I think it's quite obscene that we have companies who game the system or will have the potential to game the system in California, because ultimately it is the taxpayers of the state of California who are subsidizing or who will be subsidizing job creation, not in Southern California, Central California, or the Bay Area, but rather in other states. And I think, for example, Oregon is an example. Whether it's Nevada, whether it's Texas, whether it's Arizona, or elsewhere. So I do think it's quite obscene that we'll have folks who are gaming our system in California, and the taxpayers themselves are subsidizing job creation elsewhere other than the state of California. Three, I think it's about fairness. It's about transparency. Ms. Jackson, you articulated the whole concept of one set of rules that's applicable to all individuals, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or where they're headquartered. It's about fairness. I do think it's a little perverse, somewhat, if you will, with regards to what's happening right now in the New Jersey state legislature, where you have companies who are passionately advocating investing resources, lobbying to make sure that single sales factor indeed becomes mandatory in the state of New Jersey, while at the same time, simultaneously, they're doing everything possibly in the most passionate way to make sure it is not mandatory in the state of California. That's obscene, that's perverse, and that provides a disadvantage, a competitive disadvantage to companies in the state of California. You can't do this on one hand and do this on the other hand. It's just that simple to me. Thirdly, obviously, we've talked about, and Ms. Ross, you have always been a champion of the work that you've done. Perhaps one day you'll be beatified or canonized for the work that you've done for the marginalized in California. The budget. $1 billion is $1 billion is $1 billion. And this will be the worst budget, not that I ever faced, but the whole state of California has ever faced. $1 billion is something, whether it's for our schools, whether it's for health services, whatever it is for, it is something. And I think it is a partial solution to the budget crisis that we're dealing with. I truly believe that this is not a Republican issue. It is not a Democratic issue. It is a California issue for fairness, for creating jobs in the state of California. Again, if it's good enough for the state of Washington, who adopted it last year in April, and if it's good enough for folks in Texas, as well as New York, as well as Florida, why would we put our own companies in California that are homegrown, that are organic, at an unfair competitive disadvantage? It doesn't make sense when you want to create jobs in the state of California. So I just want to say, thank you for your testimony. Obviously, it's very clear where I stand, and I just want to underscore one last thing, too, is this is a California issue, and the San Francisco Giants may have beaten the Texas Rangers in the World Series, but it's the Texans are laughing all the way to the bank because we have single sales factor that's elective. Thank you.
Okay. Senator De Leon. Any further questions of this panel? Again, I want to thank Andrea Jackson from Genentech for being willing to come. There are others, as I said, that were invited that had schedule conflicts, like HP and Apple. We asked eBay and NBC and GE and Cisco and Comcast, Qualcomm, Caltax, the Chamber, and California Cable and Telecommunications Association. This is a critically important issue to the business community, especially those that are active throughout the country. We really regret that they aren't here, but we really do appreciate your willingness to be here. And thank you again, Jean. And we'll now move on. If I left anybody out, we'll announce it later. We'll now move on to public comment on single sales factor. And if I've misquoted any of these, please come forward. eBay is in the audience. It's okay. That would be great. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Madam Chair and Senators, Terry Brennan on behalf of SEIU California in support of the mandatory single sales factor for all the reasons discussed earlier. And it shouldn't be lost on the committee that if you get Jean and Andrea and I on the same page, you've done something magical worth pursuing.
We need a little magic. Thank you. Further testimony on this before we move to enterprise zones? All right. Let's move on to enterprise zones. Please, I'd like to ask David Newmark, Bren Fellow from the PPIC, to come forward. Alyssa Anderson, who's the Deputy Director of the California Budget Project. Chris McKaylee, who is a lobbyist with the California Credits Group and Aerospace Technology Association. And Sarah Flox, who is the Policy Coordinator of the California Labor Federation. Who was the one that couldn't come? Eileen Norcross, who is the Senior Research Fellow at George Mason University, was to have been here today, could not make it. She is ill, but we do have her testimony, and we will incorporate that into the record and share that with the committee. All right, welcome. David, you'll start. Enterprise zones.
Thank you. My name is David Newmark. I'm actually my full-time job is Professor of Economics at UC Irvine, and my part-time job is Bren Fellow at PPIC. There'll be two parts to my comments today. This is what I was asked to address, both focused on policies that are intended to create jobs. First of all, I'm going to touch briefly on evidence from studies I've done of enterprise zones and their effectiveness. And then secondly, I'll discuss a new PPIC study that focuses on explicit job creation policies of other types. Studies on enterprise zones that I did with Jed Kolko were intended to provide the most rigorous and compelling evidence on the effectiveness of California's enterprise zones to date. There's two requirements for that. One, obviously, is good data with which to measure job creation. And we achieve that by using two sources. One is we digitally mapped all enterprise zones in the state, including the various expansions that have occurred. And second, we use data from the National Establishment Time Series, the NETS, which captures the precise location of businesses as well as measures of their employment. The second thing you need, and this was mentioned in the earlier discussion, is valid comparison groups. Right? What you really want to know is how did job growth in an area designated as enterprise zone evolve compared to areas identical in every respect, except that they weren't designated. How do we achieve that, or how do we get as close as possible to that, I should say? We do that by using the maps to compare enterprise zones to areas just outside the zones in a very narrow geographical area, or even to areas that later became enterprise zones. So they were in some way similar enough that later on they were adopted as zones. The key challenge to keep in mind is this construction of comparison groups, the counterfactor, what would happen if not for the policy. Right. And this is what social science is typically all about, an evaluation of policy. It's very important to keep this issue in mind when you hear from for example, businesses that say, oh, well, we're in an enterprise zone and the enterprise zone helps us. This isn't evidence that the businesses either opened or grew because of the zone benefits. The analogy I like to make is to medical research on the effectiveness of drugs. Right? Knowing that survivors of a disease took a drug that was intended to cure the disease does nothing to prove that the drug worked. Right? You obviously need to ask what would have happened to otherwise similar people who didn't take the drug. And we know this in medical research, and we've known it for many, many decades, and we also, frankly, know it in social science research. Our studies are published in peer-reviewed public policy and urban economics journals, and the bottom line is they find no net job creation effects of enterprise zones. That is, job growth is no different in places that are designated as enterprise zones after they're designated than in very similar places that were not so designated. You might ask why. It's a little surprising. We've speculated on the reasons. We cannot answer all these questions yet. One is enterprise zones have hiring credits, but also have other incentives. And some of those other incentives may lead to labor reductions. For example, subsidies to invest in equipment. Second, and this is potentially a big issue, under enterprise zone, what you can do is substitute eligible workers for ineligible workers. And you might have no net effect on job creation. And third is that we know that many of the credits are claimed for hiring in the past that likely would have occurred anyway, and the gains are often split between the employers and the consulting firms that help them identify the credits they can get for past hiring. But a key problem with enterprise zone incentives, and it's the jumping off point for the newer research I'll talk about, is they do not explicitly target job growth. You get an enterprise zone credit for hiring a person with characteristics or who lives in an area that makes them eligible for the credit, and that's it. There's no requirement that the company be growing. The company can be shrinking, for that matter. So that brings me to this new report. It's a PPIC report entitled How Can California Spur Job Creation? And it focuses on policies that are explicitly intended to target job creation. The context for this latter study is more short-term, if you will, and that, of course, is a severe worsening of California's labor market in recent years. Unemployment rate, to recite some familiar numbers, was below 6% in 2007, now above 12%. Fairly robust job growth in the middle of the decade that went on for many years, slowed and then turned into sharp job declines. These developments have led to numerous proposals to spur the creation of jobs in the short term, and the purpose of this report was to evaluate those proposals and focusing on those we thought provided the most direct incentives for job creation. Now, to some extent, of course, the focus of this latter discussion is on the short-term response to the Great Recession, which is understandable given what has happened. And in that sense, the issues I'm discussing in this new study are somewhat different from those pertaining to enterprise zones, which are not really seen as countercyclical policy. Rather, it's a long-standing program. But it's important to realize that California's labor market problems are not only short-term. Certainly, the recession has been severe. It's been severe almost everywhere, more severe in California than many states. But it's also important to point out that California has had, for the past 20 years or so, a persistently higher unemployment rate and a persistently lower employment rate than the nation, and that's not driven by demographics, more Hispanics, whatever the case might be. It's really true for most demographic groups across the spectrum. So in that sense, there is an overlap between some of these issues of job creation policies more generally and enterprise zones. The important point, though, is we need to think about policies in both the short and the long run. And I would add that the long run becomes relatively more important because we can't do that much in the short run, given budget difficulties. So the study focuses on two types of direct job creation policies: hiring credits and worker subsidies. And when I say worker subsidies, mainly you want to be thinking about earned income tax credits. Okay? So what does a hiring credit do? A hiring credit, like in the Enterprise Zone program, is a tax credit for hiring an eligible worker. And the intent of such a credit is to increase labor demand, lower the cost of labor for firms, encourage them to hire more. Seems quite simple. When we talk about hiring credits in this context, job creation policies, typically these credits explicitly focus on job growth. They pay the credit when in some way or other employment is expanding. Now, that's easy to articulate in principle, very hard to do that in practice, although policies at both the state and federal level have tried. Historically in the U.S., at the national level, hiring credits have mainly focused on the disadvantaged. There's less experience, although there is some, with anti-recessionary credits that target the unemployed or are non-categorical completely. You're just eligible to get the credit for any hiring. Worker subsidies, in contrast, give payments to workers or to families to subsidize wages or earnings to try to induce labor market entry. So the report focuses on these two policies. The claim is not that these are the only possible policies that could create jobs, but they are the two that focus most directly on the incentives that pertain to job creation, either subsidizing employers to hire or subsidizing workers to work. And for that reason, likely to be the strongest, likely to be the most effective if anything is, but that's not a definitive claim. The report, like any research, has some limited scope. The conclusions about the effectiveness of the alternative policies differ, I think, depending on whether you're looking at the short term or the long term. When we look at non-categorical hiring credits or credits that target the unemployed in particular, there's good reason to believe that these are likely helpful in spurring job growth in the short run. Now, the evidence on this question is not equivalent to the evidence in enterprise zones, a recent study, rigorous evidence, treatment control groups, and everything else. This is drawn on a reading of past literature and assessment of that literature. There was past experience in the late 1970s with a federal credit to help the economy recover at the national level from the very steep recession of the early 1970s. And that program, the New Jobs Tax Credit, seems to have been successful. You might be thinking at this point, so why does that work and enterprise zones don't work? Is he confused, or am I confused? Speaking for you. So first, a qualifier. As I said, the evidence in enterprise zones is more rigorous. That's one important thing. But there's some other very important differences. First of all, the hiring credits to create jobs that seem to work are non-categorical or target the unemployed. In contrast, enterprise zones target the disadvantaged in one way or another. There is a lot more experience with federal hiring credits focused on the disadvantaged, and that research is quite pessimistic, suggests that those credits really are very ineffective. The reason typically put forth is those programs severely stigmatize workers. I essentially bring a piece of paper to the employer saying, here's a piece of paper that entitles you to a tax credit for hiring me, and the reason I have this piece of paper is because I've been incredibly unsuccessful in many respects or have other problems. So that's an issue, but hiring credits that seem to work are those that don't, in some sense, signal to the employer you're disadvantaged. The way to think about it is, somebody who has a long history of disadvantage and might be eligible for one of those credits may have many. It may be plausible for the employer to think that workers' productivity isn't very high. Somebody who's unemployed now, when unemployment rate was over 12% in California, good chance they're unemployed through absolutely no fault of their own, but something that happened to their firm. So it's not the same negative signal. The second is that the hiring credits that I'm talking about that seem to be more effective are those focused on countering recessions. They're not general long-standing hiring credits. And the third is that these kind of hiring credits are explicitly linked to job creation. And the new job tax credit in California, although very limited, has that built into it as well. It is supposed to go to firms which are experiencing growth in full-time employment. What about worker subsidies like an earned income tax credit? In the short term, I don't think these are really the place we should be looking. In the longer term, however, they may be something to think about. There's unambiguous evidence from the research literature that the EITC increases employment, and it increases employment in particular among low-income single mothers. As such, the EITC has beneficial distributional effects in the sense of increasing incomes and as well as providing more support to very low-income and poor families. That's often an argument for the EITC over hiring credits paid to employers, the distributional benefits. I think there's two reasons, though, that we shouldn't be we shouldn't buy into that argument in the short run only. First of all, although I think those distributional effects are important, the Great Recession has really hammered men. If you look at unemployment rates of men versus women, they've really gone up much more steeply for males, and that's because of the industries they work in. That's essentially the reason. Point being, a little help directed towards the recently unemployed will actually be helping families that have suffered significant declines in income as a result of the recession. Second, an earned income tax credit operates by bringing more people in the labor market, and it doesn't take a lot of common sense, although some macroeconomists would argue with me, to think that bringing more people into the labor market is not the problem right now. Right? The problem right now is insufficient demand. So we probably want to think more about subsidizing the hiring side of anything. So with that said, let me now step back and say that although I think both kinds of policies have an effect on job creation, hiring credits on the job creation side more in the short term, they're limited. They have a limited scope at any feasible level of spending. And that's very important to keep in mind. Neither policy produces jobs cheaply. Hiring credits, there's a range of estimates. I think the more plausible range of estimates per job created is about $9,000 to $40,000, and the report goes through all these calculations. Worker subsidies cost more, and the range is even bigger, probably from $50,000 to $100,000. These don't take account of other benefits, multiplier effects, increase in tax revenue to the government. It's in some sense direct and short-term budgetary outlay. While those numbers sound high, to put them in perspective, if you do the back-of-the-envelope calculation on what the federal stimulus costs per job created, these are much more effective. Hiring credits, in particular, per dollar spent, seem to be about 7 times more effective than the federal stimulus. And that's probably because they create direct incentives to hire, as opposed to other types of government stimulus. But of course, that comparison isn't really fair because the federal government can borrow vast amounts of money at very low interest rates, at least currently. So they could federal stimulus spending in California, if you take the total and divide it according to population, it's something like $68 billion. Right, that's obviously not going to happen in California. If we spent $1 billion, which is presumably the upper end of anything feasible, and 0 might be the more reasonable number, but suppose we spent $1 billion, what might happen based on these estimates? The unemployment rate would fall by at most a 0.5 percentage point, create at most 100,000 jobs, and those effects would probably be somewhat smaller. So would a hiring credit help? Probably. Would it do a lot relative to what's happened because of the Great Recession? Of course not. Recovering from the Great Recession, getting from 12% back to 6 or 7%, the answer to that is not policy. The answer to that is national, international economic recovery, and we have to keep that in mind just to keep a sense of perspective. So this research doesn't lead to any specific endorsement of a policy. That's not its goal. What it says is if the state wants to create money, wants to spend money, to create jobs, the following conclusions follow. In the short term, in response to a recession, hiring credits are probably the better policy compared to worker subsidies. Very important to make hiring credits effective, and there's a long discussion of this in the report. You want to target the unemployed. You clearly want to target new job creation. You want to keep the rules very simple because if administrative costs get high, employers don't bother. You probably don't want to restrict the credit, unlike the new jobs credit currently, which is restricted to very small businesses. That limits effectiveness severely. And you probably want to avoid these specific credits targeting job creation to morph into general tax relief, that is, credits for hiring that would have happened anyways. There may obviously be good reasons for general tax relief, but we should keep those arguments separate. In the long term, I think there's a couple other things we might say. I think a state earned income tax credit is something the state ought to consider. It's obviously been brought up many times before. It does distribute more income, not just government spending, but actually earned income to poor families, because those heads of poor families actually enter the labor market and earn more. So more families earn their way out of poverty when you enact an EITC, as well as whatever the government gives them. Many other states have an EITC, very easy to piggyback onto the federal EITC. If you look at state tax forms where there's an EITC, it's often a couple of lines. It's really quite easy to do, and it's done through the income tax system. Tying back to the early discussion, there's no basis in the research for thinking that state enterprise zones are helpful for job creation. And finally, I think it's important to be forward-looking. Aside from solving current problems, you all know this, but we sometimes forget, this isn't the last recession, right? There will be another one. I don't know when. Likely not nearly as steep as this one, because they usually aren't. And to be ready for the next one, I think, so that we're not having this debate at this point of the business cycle, that is, as we are already coming out of the recession, albeit slowly, I think it's worth thinking about having a hiring credit on the books that turns on aggressively when the economy slows and then turns off again when the economy starts to recover. That's the kind of thing that can be enacted without current spending, which is one advantage. I really think, based on the evidence, it can cushion the state, cushion it, not prevent it, cushion the state against the kind of blow it suffered in the most recent recession. And such a policy uses the state's resources to try to create jobs when the private sector needs a little extra help, and doesn't waste them when the private sector is generating plenty of jobs. Thank you.
Ms. Anderson, you're next from the California Budget Project.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the chair and members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. My name is Alyssa Anderson, and I'm Deputy Director of the California Budget Project. And I'm here to speak in favor of the governor's proposal to eliminate enterprise zones based on the weight of the evidence, which shows that the enterprise zone program places an increased strain on the budget, yet fails to achieve its key goals, which are to create jobs, as Mr. Newmark just discussed, and stimulate business investment in distressed communities. I'd like to briefly walk you through the findings of a report we recently published, which pulls together key facts on the enterprise zone program using the most up-to-date franchise tax board data. And this should be in your packets. So what do the data show? First, enterprise zones are very costly. The cost to the state has skyrocketed from well under $1 million in 1986 to about $466 million in 2008, for a total cost to the state of $3.6 billion since the program's inception. So essentially, the cost of the program has doubled about every 3 to 4 years. And the cost per zone has also increased substantially. The data also show that very large corporations, not small businesses, are the primary beneficiaries of the enterprise zone program. Corporations with assets of $1 billion or more claimed about 70% of the total dollar value of tax credits in 2008, even though these businesses represent less than half of 1% of corporate tax filers. Small corporations, those with assets under $1 million, claimed less than 2% of credits in 2008. Now, some have said this finding simply reflects the fact that large corporations claim large dollar amounts of credits because they're large, but in fact, a disproportionate number of large corporations also claim credits. More than 1 out of 8 very large corporations statewide claimed enterprise zone tax credits in 2008, compared to 3 out of 1,000 small corporations. So what that means is that very large corporations are about 45 times as likely to claim tax credits, enterprise zone tax credits, as small corporations. The data also show that the enterprise zone program is not well targeted to the most economically distressed areas of the state. For example, corporations in San Francisco claimed the largest dollar value in tax credits, about $26 million in 2008, while those in more rural areas with very high unemployment rates claim a much smaller share. In Calexico, for example, corporations claimed under $1 million in credits in 2008. But Imperial County has 3 times the unemployment rate as San Francisco. And also, as we documented in a report we published a few years ago, the vast majority of census tracts in the San Francisco enterprise zone were not economically distressed 8 years after that zone was established. Finally, the data in our report show that retail and wholesale trade corporations claim the largest share of enterprise zone tax credits, just under 1/3 of the total dollar value. Since retailers serve local markets, they tend to locate near their customer base. This suggests that a significant share of the credits go to companies whose location decisions are not likely to be influenced by enterprise zone tax benefits. So in conclusion, we recognize that you face very difficult choices, many of which are controversial, and we appreciate the task before you. In this case, I believe there's strong evidence to support the elimination of the enterprise zone program because the program is costly and because research showed that they are ineffective. However, should the legislature decide to modify rather than eliminate the program, we would recommend dramatically reducing the scope of the program to only focus on a very small number of extremely distressed areas and small businesses, because doing so would dramatically reduce the cost of the program and could potentially increase its success. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll now move to Chris McKaylee, who is here for the California Credits Group and California Aerospace Technology Association. Welcome, Chris.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. Thank you. A couple of points on the governor's proposed repeal of the enterprise zone tax credits. The first is we question the revenue estimate and the proposed savings. First of all, what you have before you is an unprecedented retroactive tax increase that we've never seen before. While the LAO has proposed expiration of the enterprise zones and other such modifications over the years, no one has proposed elimination of carry forwards in addition to loss of the credits on a going forward basis. To us, it's a real form of bait and switch taxation when you lure businesses into economically distressed areas, dangling in front of them these targeted tax incentives, and then are going to withdraw them after the fact and after the investment has already occurred. Does the revenue estimate, from our understanding, about 60% of the revenue estimate is the carry forward amount. The remainder is on an ongoing savings with total elimination of the credits. So we question 60% of that revenue estimate, whether or not it's actually achievable. I think a detailed legal analysis will be coming later this week that argues that this is a violation of both the contracts and due process clauses of both the state and federal constitutions. Another point on the revenue estimate is today, when you claim the hiring tax credit, you are disallowed a wage expense deduction in the same amount. Based upon our review of the DOF proposed language, there is no provision there to add back that wage expense disallowance, which means taxpayers would be harmed not once but twice. First, by elimination retroactively of the credits, but then on top of it would not be allowed to go back and make up for the fact that those credit carry forwards are eliminated. Likewise, on a going forward basis, you've got to take into account that, okay, if you've eliminated the credits, you will be allowed a wage expense deduction. Is that calculated in the revenue estimate? Also, what is the impact of these folks no longer potentially being hired? Ex-offenders, those on public assistance. Professor Swenson from USC, who did before your committee last year, Madam Chair, at Rev and Tax, you had both PPIC and the USC study going back and forth, arguing the merits of each other's studies. He recently opined the average public assistance recipient is $23,000. If somebody has received a job and is employed and paying taxes, and that employer receives this tax credit, what is the potential offset of those people not being employed and receiving public assistance? There's a cost arguably on both sides. Is that factored into the revenue estimate? And lastly, of course, these are done on a static model. What is the dynamic impact if you accept the governor's proposal, if you enact it, if it is lawful to be done? What is the impact of a $924 million, almost $1 billion tax increase over the next 18 months? The second point is we think that this breaks a contract with both taxpayers and local governments. Now, while the governor's proposal is an elimination of the credits and not the 42 enterprise zones themselves, it's very clear that both the zones and the taxpayers in those zones believe that there is a 15-year term. And in fact, in the government code, it very explicitly says that once designated, the term shall be 15 years. And of course, the local jurisdictions enter into a 15-year contract with the state of California by way of the MOU. I think other earlier speakers, the LAO in particular, indicated long-term decisions and the lack of certainty in the ability to plan. And the aerospace industry in particular, being with them on some of their lobby visits last month here, their main focus is certainty because their planning decisions are 12 to 15 years. And not only is the threat of repeal creating uncertainty, what's even more shocking to them is the fact that the proposal is to retroactively go back and take what's otherwise been earned but not fully utilized. And I think that this continues to perpetuate the negative business climate, and even the LAO this morning recognized that it raises serious concerns about the treatment of businesses in the state. The third point is look at the broader context of the proposal. Again, a potential slightly less than $1 billion tax increase over the next 18 months. We already have the the highest sales tax base. We have one of the most progressive PIT systems, personal income tax systems in the nation. We have one of the highest corporate tax rates in the country. In 08 and 09, we reduced by 50% your ability to utilize all tax credits, both enterprise zone, R&D, and others. We continue to have, I think most recently the statement is, the second highest unemployment rate in the nation. By the way, 43 other states have some version of an enterprise zone program. I think 5 or 6 of them have the entire state, which I've heard others advocate around here. But if they're so bad, why do 43 other states have them, including the state of California? The governor's proposal that came out on January 10th has been a tremendous marketing piece. Aerospace industry, other businesses around this state have received specific requests to come and visit from other states: Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, North Carolina, and the specific part of that solicitation is the governor's proposal to retroactively eliminate EZ credits. Now, we believe that there's been great success in the program, and I'm not going to rehash the competing studies. You already heard that last year. I would note one thing on the PPIC study, and I think one of the criticisms that's legitimately lodged is the issue of ranges of job creation. This is self-reported data from Dun & Bradstreet as opposed to the USC study that used census tract data. But I think the other point is that there was criticism lodged by PPIC, I think in the Assembly Budget Subcommittee, on 3 areas that were reviewed by USC: poverty level, unemployment, and median income. And the PPIC had criticized the USC study by Professor Swenson that he examined that. Interestingly, when an enterprise zone makes application to HCD in a competitive process, there are 5 criteria by which they have to judge each of their census tracts to determine whether or not they qualify. That's essentially how an EZ geographic boundaries are initially drawn. 3 of the 5 eligibility criterion are based on high unemployment, high level of poverty, and low median income. 3 of the areas studied by the USC study and that were criticized by PPIC. So respectfully, I'm unclear as to the legitimacy of that complaint. The point I've made to your committee repeatedly, Madam Chair, is I think by definition the EZ program is effective. And I say that for 2 reasons. You have to remember what the purpose is. If you go back to 7070 roughly of the government code, it talks about business investment in economically distressed areas of the state. The state of California through HCD has developed the criteria by which we judge economic distress. We have multiple applicants for a few zone slots, most recently 13 applicants for 8 slots. I think in one designation round there were 10 unsuccessful applicants, and according to HCD, the 10 who didn't get an enterprise zone designation all would have qualified under the law. So clearly there are economically distressed areas of the state in need of assistance. Now I say by definition because we talk a lot about the hiring credit. There are roughly, depending on how you count them, 14 eligibility criteria. Not only do you have to hire somebody in one of those eligibility criteria in order to claim the credit, no, you don't get a credit for any hire. It's just like you don't get a credit for any piece of equipment purchase. It has to meet some of the eligibility criteria in order for you to claim that credit. So not only do you have to meet one of these disadvantaged individuals, hard to employ, as was indicated earlier, but you have 2 additional tests. They have to spend at least 90% of their time on the EZ-related business. And secondly, they have to actually spend 50% or more of the time in the EZ's boundaries itself. So it's not just meeting an eligibility criteria, it's also meeting those 2 tests that have to be documented in a labor-intensive process. There are also limitations through the apportionment formula, which we think artificially depress usage and are another form of bait-and-switch taxation. A lot of the, big bad corporations that claim these credits are also severely limited. I'll wrap up. One final point, if you will, although I have another 30 minutes to go. I know you won't let me.
But the Budget Committee is coming
yes, I
to
understand.
do bad things.
The last of the 5 key points, if I could, and then I'm happy to tackle questions. Thank you, Senator. The reform process, we believe, ought to be allowed to resume. Which would lead into a reform discussion. I provided some in your packet. I think they're the last section in there. The business community has submitted in your prior hearings some specific reforms. But let me just make this point. We'd rather see the program reformed. Both LAO, PPIC, Department of Finance have all acknowledged that, yes, there are some successful zones. Many other, in their opinion, are unsuccessful. 2 years ago, both committees held informational hearings. They were done throughout the state, Sacramento, San Diego, the Silicon Valley. The committees received over 110 recommendations, and last year there was a convening of a work group of which my colleagues were also a part. Unfortunately, in order to achieve a consensus product, some people withdrew from those discussions. No aspersions cast at all. It was supposed to be a consensus product. You can't have a consensus if everyone doesn't agree. We think we ought to go back to that negotiating table and make needed reforms to the program rather than eliminate it. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Sarah Flox from the Labor Federation. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Senators. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Sarah Flox, and I'm here from the California Labor Federation. And I'm going to speak today about why the California Labor Federation supports the governor's proposal to eliminate the Enterprise Zone program. As Mr. McKaylee mentioned, we did participate in stakeholder meetings last year to discuss reform scenarios for the Enterprise Zone program. And through that process, we came to the conclusion that a reform would merely be tinkering around the edges of what is a failed and fundamentally flawed program. I'm not going to rehash a lot of the evidence and academic research that points to the fact that this program is not effective, that it doesn't create jobs and hasn't been a benefit to the state, nor have taxpayers gotten a return on their investment in the program. But I am going to go through 3 key reasons why we feel that enterprise zones do not work and should be eliminated. Excuse me. First, the Enterprise Zone program has grown too large to effectively target job creation in the hardest hit areas of the state. Instead, it has become a subsidy for big business. My colleague from the California Budget Project has touched on some of the facts of this, that there are billion-dollar corporations that are claiming the majority of these enterprise zone credits, and a lot of them are in the downtown financial districts of San Francisco and Los Angeles. Between 2006 and 2008, the San Francisco and Los Angeles EZs expanded. They expanded into the downtown financial districts where major businesses are already located. What this does is that it weakens the incentive for business to move into places like El Centro, Yuba City, Modesto, Merced, the places that have the highest unemployment rates in the state. So instead of creating jobs where people really need jobs, where they really need to go back to work, we're spending money to subsidize big corporations for setting up wherever they want, wherever they have already made the business decision to locate. In other words, we're subsidizing Wells Fargo to be in downtown San Francisco. The second reason that we would give to eliminate the EZ program is that they're subsidizing a race to the bottom. The EZ hiring tax credit is given for new hires and not new jobs. Every time an employer fires a worker and hires a new person, they can claim a new tax credit. Mr. McKaylee said that there are certain criteria that employers need to meet in order to get this hiring credit. One of those is that the employee lives in a target employment area. The standards for this are basically almost any area that's contiguous to an enterprise zone. I believe it's 51% of residents are living below the poverty line. This could be the Tenderloin, it could be SOMA, it could be parts where there are very high-income people living, and employers can get a hiring credit for hiring people from the TEAs. The tax credit also, the hiring tax credit also caps the credit at 150% of the minimum wage, or $12. So employers really have no incentive to be paying higher wages because they're getting a credit for creating minimum wage jobs. So basically what we're doing is we're rewarding employers that create high turnover, low wage jobs rather than good employers that offer stable career jobs. I'd also like to give an example of how the enterprise zone have created a race to the bottom. I'm going to talk about VWR, which is a company that's located in Brisbane, California. It's a medical distribution company. For the last 50 years, the Teamsters Union have represented workers at this company. In 2007, Madison Dearborn, which is a private equity firm in Chicago, bought the company. And within the last year, VWR announced that they're going to be closing both their Brisbane and their San Dimas locations and moving their facility to Visalia. And so far, they've refused to let the 200 longtime employees transfer to Visalia. Visalia happens to be in a targeted tax area. This is kind of like an enterprise zone light. It's part of the enterprise zone program and has been targeted for elimination by the governor. And in Visalia, VWR has been touting the hundreds of new jobs that they're going to be bringing to the area. So while union workers were making $35 an hour, including benefits in Brisbane, workers in Visalia will probably be making about $12 an hour. And for every job moved from Brisbane to Visalia, VWR can claim an easy hiring tax credit, which is worth up to $37,000 per employee over the life of the credit. This is not job creation. This is job pirating. And the worst part is that taxpayers are funding the elimination of good jobs in one area of the state to create lower paying jobs in another area of the state. We're paying to put people out on the street who have worked at this company for 20, 25, and 30 years who are within 1 or 2 years of retirement. They paid into their pension this entire time, and they're seeing their jobs moved by this program to Visalia. We're also paying to devastate a community. Brisbane is going to lose 50% of their sales tax revenue base when this company moves. That's 12% of their general fund. So ironically, after VWR leaves Brisbane, they may be able to apply for an enterprise zone designation, which they don't have now. So basically, EZs are pitting cities against each other in a race to the bottom, and the taxpayers are funding it, and we're not getting new jobs. Third, we feel that the EZs are using public dollars to subsidize a very profitable cottage industry of tax consultants and lobbyists, and we think this is the worst example of waste and abuse of taxpayer dollars. These consultants go through the zones looking for businesses to help them claim EZ tax credits for workers they have previously hired, even if the employee has left the job. And they make their money by taking a percentage, a contingency fee, of the tax savings to the business. They send letters to into the EZs and say that they'll provide free consultation services and guarantee no payment unless tax credits are taken. They spend a few hours going through a company's payroll records, looking for qualified employees that have been hired over the last 4 years, and then taking them to their offices and filing for retroactive hiring credits through the Enterprise Zone program. This type of consultant arrangement explains the growth of the EZ program from $675,000 in 1986 to $465 million in 2008. So how much of our taxpayer dollars have gone to high-paid consultants? It works out well for consultants, but it's not so great for taxpayers since no new jobs were created and no new workers were hired. I actually want to read a couple of quotes from some of these easy consultants that are on their websites to just show what is out there in the public in terms of how taxpayer dollars are getting used. From the CLC Tax Credits website, they state as their mission to make a profit by getting the most money in enterprise zone tax credits available to our clients as effectively as possible. The enterprise zone company, our primary focus is assisting corporations to maximize the benefit from the California Enterprise Zone program. The EZ company offers a unique level of expertise in this lucrative incentive program. The California Enterprise Zone Tax Saving Group. Our history proves we qualify on average 30 to 45% of all employees interviewed. Each employee can result in a $40,000 tax reduction. When, and only when you save money, we receive 25% of the savings. You have total control over how to invest the tax savings in your business. The state, California, has imposed no restrictions on the use of these funds. At a time when California faces deep and painful cuts to every program that matters to us, it is unconscionable that the state is spending millions on consultants and their high-priced lobbyists. Once again, this is not job creation. It's a giveaway to high-priced consultants, lobbyists, and PR firms, and it's costing the state millions of dollars a year. And finally, the decision to eliminate the Enterprise Zone program doesn't exist in a vacuum. If we do not do away with this program, then we're going to have to face another $924 million in cuts. And we know where those cuts are going to come from. It's going to come from the programs we care about, like schools and public safety, in-home supportive services, and Medi-Cal. We do agree that California needs an economic development strategy that creates jobs. However, spending through the tax code without accountability or transparency is a recipe for failure. We recommend that any future job creation programs rely on either direct grants or subsidies. But whether it's a direct grant program or a tax credit program, we want to make sure that all of these include clear goals for job creation, performance measures, annual review of performance, and a recapture provision that allows the state to take back a subsidy if the firm is not living up to their promise to the state and to the taxpayers of California. We believe that California can no longer afford the Enterprise Zone program, and we support its elimination. Thank you very much for your time.
Any questions by members? I've got a quick question related to your illustration of Brisbane to Visalia, the business that moved. Was it medical devices they were making?
They're sales and distribution, yes.
Sales and distribution.
And so in Brisbane, they're actually closer to many of their clients.
So it sounds from what you're saying it was an economic decision that took them from Brisbane to Visalia, correct?
Yes.
Is there anything to suggest that they couldn't have kept going on the other side of the border and taken those jobs completely out of California?
That they couldn't have left the state?
Without the tax incentives that were given in Visalia?
Well, given that many of their largest clients are in the state of California, it makes sense as if they're doing distribution to be close to their client base. They have UC, they have Genentech, they have many of the California companies, and so I would assume that some of their business location decision would be closer to the clients that they have to have in-time delivery to.
I'm sure that factors into it, but there's a lot of more complex things, such as the Prius being manufactured in, was it Fremont, that ended up going out of state because it was cheaper to truck them back or put them on a rail car as opposed to right here where they're used primarily. Similarly, when we developed technology and the company's headquartered in California, they did the manufacturing in Mississippi for solar panels, I believe, and I'm sure there's a higher percentage of those coming back to the state. So just I understand what you're saying, and it sounds like we're just robbing from one area for another, but I think as legislators we have to also consider that people do have options to move not just out of state but out of country. And so, you know, any incentive we keep them, it's sad that those were laid off after 30 years, but that was 30 years of employment that those people may not have had. I just offer that as a counter that, you know, it's not a zero-sum game. You can't just assume that they're going to be moving to California without some other incentive to keep them here when other states do have incentives to attract them there.
And Senator, I'm not saying that we oppose any kind of incentive program, but we would oppose an incentive program that is destroying good jobs and not creating new jobs. We feel like if we do have a targeted business subsidy program that actually attracts companies from out of state and makes sure that we keep companies in state with some guarantee to taxpayers that we're not going to be slashing jobs, well-paying jobs, which then is going to be lowering our tax base and is going to be a net loss to the state anyway. So we would support the creation of a job creation of an economic development program that had very clear accountability in it and had certain performance standards. That would be fantastic. We would love to see that happen.
Well, regardless of how this turns out, let's work on that.
Great. Thank you, sir.
All right. Mr. Vice Chair, are we ready to move on to public comment? I want to thank the panel for their testimony, and I'd like to see a hands of those who are interested. Come forward. Come forward. We're going to set the timer at 1 minute. Please do that.
I'll be brief.
Okay. Come on down, everybody. Let's go. All right.
Madam Chair.
And, excuse me, I would like to ask the sergeant to notify the rest of the committee that I will be opening the roll and shutting down soon, very quickly. Yes, sir.
Madam Chair, members,
Welcome.
Will Doring representing the city of Brawley, which is probably in the county the highest unemployment rate in the state, if not some parts of the country. And listening to some of the testimony, it appears to me that not all enterprise zones are created equal. The enterprise zone in Brawley works exceptionally well. And most all of our companies, I don't know of an outside company, they're all local companies. Our economic development, we go door to door, we knock on door to door, we meet with the business sector. We have over almost 400 people that are now vouchered, and it's above minimum wage, $9. And I think that, Madam Chair, you mentioned criteria or something, so I think rather than throwing out all the enterprise zones, that perhaps something like Senator Perez's reform package to get them reformed and to make them work, because I think in the city of Brawley to get rid of our enterprise zone would cost a lot of jobs, and we would support some kind of a compromise rather than, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Thank you.
Welcome.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Shane Gussman on behalf of the Teamsters, United Food and Commercial Workers, Unite Here, the Amalgamated Transit Union, and the Machinists. All of those unions support the governor's proposal to eliminate the enterprise zones. As you heard from the California Labor Federation, the Teamsters in particular are suffering from some of the job loss when one enterprise zone rips off jobs from another area. We believe that kind of takes place a lot within the state of California. We agree but we also would support sort of a targeted approach for job creation and economic development. But what we really need is a program that works. And you all are faced with the elimination in this budget of programs that actually work. Services for the disabled, medical care for the poor, public education. You are going to be eliminating programs. Why not start with the ones that don't work? Thank you.
Welcome.
Good morning. Todd Ammett, President and CEO of the Anaheim Chamber of Commerce. We recently were designated as a zone during this last cycle. I think it was the week before Christmas we got designation, and the week after Christmas we heard about the possible elimination. As we went through the process, we started the process 2 years ago and applied last year, and we're one of the 10 who qualified, but there was only 2 zones available. We then worked on legislation to try to expand the zones, because all those zones working together would have created about an additional 100,000 jobs in California. Very important for us. Over the last 4 years, we've lost 25,000 jobs in Anaheim, and we've lost them in all different sectors, and mainly in our manufacturing and technology-based areas. Our Canyon Business Center, in an area we used to run at a very, very low vacancy, we have over 6 million square feet of open space today. That's where most of those jobs were lost. They were the average wage job that was lost for us was in the $60,000 range. This last Saturday, picked up the register, and it was I think this kind of sums up what's happening in California, that California set a state record as well as a national record with $22.9 billion paid out in unemployment benefits last year. That was more than 3.8 million claims for unemployment, which New York, Texas, and Florida didn't hit that number combined for the unemployment claims last year. We're seeing jobs in our community leave left and right. When we've pulled all of our brokers together that work in our community, both at our regional as well as international relocators. When we told them about the possible enterprise zone and that we were getting it, we have probably on an average day 10 companies calling to find out, is the zone going to stay? And we can right now identify upwards of 5,000 new jobs that would happen this fiscal year coming up once we get our designation of companies waiting to sign leases and to employ people right here in California. Their choice is not to move to another community, but to go to another state or out of country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Madam Chair. Jeremy Smith here on behalf of the State Building and Construction Trades Council. I'd just like to associate myself with the comments made by Ms. Flocks from the Labor Federation and Mr. Gussman.
Okay, thank you. Next, please. I'd like people to come up, please, so we're not waiting here.
Madam Chair and Senators,
Yes.
Terry Brennan on behalf of SEIU California. In previous testimony, there was some selective quoting of the LAO report. I'd just like to read one statement out of it, which says, programs not shown to be effective. Most rigorous research has found that enterprise zones do not create a net increase in jobs or increase the rate of job creation. Why are we spending nearly $1 billion on programs that don't work? This is a week of school. This would restore many of the cuts that are on the table right now in the governor's package, and without doing this, you've got to consider all those cuts again. For that reason, we're supporting the governor's proposal.
Thank you very much. Next, please. Welcome.
Madam Chair, members, Brian Reese, representing the California Poultry Federation. I'll be brief, and I'd like to use as a jump-off point Senator Huff's comments of earlier. A lot of our member companies, including Foster Farms and Zaki Farms, have large processing plants throughout the Central Valley, which, as many of you know, have suffering from extreme unemployment. Specifically to Senator Huff's point, we use these tax credits in the example specifically of Foster Farms to mitigate what is really a competitive disadvantage that we have against other poultry producers in other states, most notably Tyson in the state of Arkansas, Purdue farms throughout the Midwest. And again, the utilization of these tax credits really helps us offset what is a high cost of doing business in California with companies that we compete with out of state. The other point that we'd also like to make is Foster Farms does have processing plants outside of California, but they view themselves as a California company. Unfortunately, though, when we have to make decisions as to where future expansion is going to occur,
I'm going to ask you to sum up.
We have to take that the possible elimination of these tax credits into consideration. We appreciate efforts to reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, Sidney Singleton, representing the California Black Chamber of Commerce. The vast majority of our members are minority businesses, and many of them reside within enterprise zones. We know that enterprise zones hire a significant number of people of color, of diverse people of color. And most of those have barriers to employment. I heard them speak about hiring people with barriers to employment. Well, many of our members, the people that they hire, have serious barriers to employment. Enterprise zone businesses struggle just to keep their doors open in our communities. And enterprise zones have been an effective tool in the minority communities here in California. Number one, they attract new businesses to California. Enterprise zones also create new jobs, and they employ those with barriers to employment. And we believe that enterprise zones are California's bridge over troubled water in California. I implore you that don't blow up the bridge. Don't blow up the bridge. If it needs repair, repair it. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, committee members. My name is Tim Nelson. I'm Vice President of Marketing for NorCal Products, a manufacturer located in Siskiyou County. Siskiyou County is at the top of California. Interstate 5 bisects it, and it's usually a little off the radar screen, but we are one of the largest employers in Siskiyou County. Siskiyou County was primarily a timber, ranching, and recreation-based economy in the 80s. The timber practices changed significantly, and the allowable board feet of cut off the national forest was reduced by 90%. Our unemployment rate at that point went up to just around 20%. The enterprise zone was established in 1993. Since then, NorCal Products, which was established in 1962, has grown to 237 employees. We use the enterprise zone hiring credits extensively. We have hired since 2006 132 qualified new hires.
I'll ask you to sum up, please.
Okay. And last year we purchased $1.25 million for manufacturing equipment. And we have a payroll of $11 to $12 million that stays in Siskiyou County. So we would request that Siskiyou County at least be kept alive as far as the enterprise zone. It is a benefit to us. We create jobs.
Next, please. Welcome.
I'm Nancy Villas from the City of Eureka's Enterprise Zone. I'd like to talk about a small business that has had tremendous results from the program. A local brewery, Lost Coast Brewery, founded in 1986 by Barbara Groom. She started out as a very small brewery. She's now grown to have 77 employees, operating a 40,000 barrel brewery. She's been able to do this by using the Enterprise Zone tax credits. Please don't eliminate this program. It creates jobs and employs people, and our community needs it. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. Welcome.
Madam Chair, members, David Jones on behalf of the cities of Lancaster, Pasadena, and Sacramento. Local governments make significant investments of their own resources to get these zones going, and so we'd ask for reforms, not elimination. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Madam Chair and members, Dan Carrick on behalf of the League of California Cities. The Enterprise Zone program has been a very important tool for local governments for a number of years. We oppose the governor's proposal to eliminate them. These zones are selected, as was testimony earlier, these zones are selected in partnership with the state of California. It's one thing to talk about tightening up criteria going forward, but to sort of overnight eliminate these zones, we think not only breaks face with the communities that have applied for these zones and the businesses that have elected to located in these zones, the employees they've hired. So we think it's much more appropriate to reform the tool rather than eliminate it.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. You didn't sit down in that order, so who is next?
I know. I'm sorry. I was standing up.
It doesn't matter. Whoever was next, please go forward.
Okay. Yolanda Benson, representing the California Association of Enterprise Zones. We make up the administrators, the site locators, and we work with businesses, obviously. So we basically are the city local economic development folks that are out there working to keep and when we are successful to attract businesses, I will tell you that the attraction of businesses has definitely been more difficult, especially with this announcement of this proposal. There have been jobs that were being worked on to bring into the Imperial County area and LA area that have absolutely said there is no way that we would go to California with this kind of reneging on a contract. If you don't do it this year, you'll do it next year. So it is important to know that those kinds of discussions are important to the overall economy of California. I want to point out just a couple of things that have not been mentioned because obviously the importance of the program are being discussed by others. But for instance, with the VWR discussion that happened about the company moving from Brisbane to Tulare was because there was a merger and acquisition of that company. It did not stay a California company. So it's really a question of mergers and acquisitions and what happens with employees.
I'll ask you to
I think
sum up.
that should be part of that discussion and not that it just moved to an enterprise zone. I do have a report.
I do want you to sum up.
I do have a report that is taken from the vouchers from when people are hired, and we show that over 118,000 jobs were created and retained in California, specifically from the vouchers that we ask, is this a job that's existing and are you filling it, or is this a new job? That question is asked when the person is hired. This is all from voucher information that Enterprise Zone administrators use. I'm leaving it to give to you, and I'll give it to the sergeant to hand to you. So
Thank you for that.
It does work, and this is just for 2010, where over 2,400 ex-offenders were hired, which is probably one of the most difficult targeted barriers to employment.
Thank you for that. Next. Sure.
Ms. Benson, I wanted to follow with what you were just speaking of here a little bit, in that we've heard some very tough assessments of this earlier in this hearing on enterprise zones, and with the situation where dollars are going into the highest level corporations in downtown San Francisco, for example, and that's probably not really passing the smell test for a lot of people as to what the purpose of these is. The Siskiyou County folks, they're down here today, and that looks a little more like the picture of what we're talking about. And the gentleman from the Black Chamber of Commerce, I think he was talking about the same type of thing. Those are the things we're really, I think the intention was to reach there. So how do we better quantify that we're actually reaching the areas that truly need this, and how do we better reform that, and how do we account for that these are actually new jobs with a better system of accounting for that, instead of, as was talked about, fire one person, hire another one like that. And how do we have that accountability so that we can better target what I think was really well intentioned at before? And I'm hearing a lot of people say don't eliminate it, just reform it. So how do we get to the area of reforming this to where it would really target those types of areas that we want to attract or revitalize?
Well, in drawing maps, and thank you, Madam Chair. In drawing the map, you definitely look at areas of high unemployment and areas of poverty, but you don't build business in a residential neighborhood. You build it in industrial zoned areas. So when you're drawing the boundary, you are trying to bring as many of the neighborhoods into it that do meet that criteria, but you also have to bring in the business parks, because that's where the jobs are going to be. So it just so happens that there is a lot of poverty in downtown San Francisco. So when a business does locate there, they potentially do have the ability to take advantage of the hiring credit, but only if they're hiring somebody off of public assistance or someone with those barriers to employment, not just for anybody that they hire. So they are giving opportunities to people who may not have that opportunity. Is that where we want that to happen? That's part of where the reform discussions over the last year, during 5 months of negotiation, we spent time and went over these kinds of details of reform, and that's where we would like to go again. If there's a way to make it better and more accountable, we want to do that. As of 2006, more accountability has been placed on the zones, and as of 2008, almost all 42 zones are brand new zones. They're not even what was looked at back in 2000 through 2004. None of that are the zones that exist today. Some aspects of the cities might be within that zone location, but the zone itself is different. You have to have an economic strategy. You have to have a plan. Things are accountable now. We have to report more to HCD, and we're ready to do it.
Let me jump in. Have the new zones even been assessed then in the statistics that are being talked about here?
No, as a matter of fact, some are still what they call conditional, because they're not even in their, they haven't even been finalized.
Senator, we have a budget committee that is really wants the room. So thank you very much for that response. Welcome.
Madam Chair, thank you. My name is Yolanda Lee, and I'm the Enterprise Zone Manager for San Jose. And I would just like to say it's important not to eliminate the program. I'm okay with the reforms, but do not eliminate this program now. I have manufacturing companies that are creating blue-collar manufacturing jobs, and they're all concerned. They do not have to be here. And as a matter of fact, they've been contacted by Nevada, Arizona, and some other states. And so this has been the only incentive that has helped them to stay in California. And with our unemployment rate the way it is, we need any kind of incentive or any kind of a tool to compete with out-of-state companies.
Thank you. And welcome. Our last speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Tanya Dowse, and I represent the Siskiyou Enterprise Zone. You heard from one of our fellow businesses just a moment ago, and he really is the example of a success story in our county. We are on the northern border of California. We're one of the largest counties in California. Geographically, we're also extraordinarily distressed, and we're also extraordinarily rural. In 2010, we created 500 jobs in our enterprise zone and or retained. For us, job retention is just as important as job creation. Indeed, the enterprise zone represents a survival strategy for our communities.
Thank you very much. We now have the final piece of business. We have to open the roll on the committee rules. Would you please call the absent members?
DeSaulnier? Aye. DeSaulnier, aye. Fuller? Aye. Fuller, aye. Kehoe? Liu? Aye. Liu, aye.
All right, we'll hold it 8-0, and we'll hold it open for, would you ask Senator Kehoe to come back in? Is she outside? Or would you please ask her to come back in? I'll open we'll move on to the designation of the committee assistants. That's Marissa Lanchester and Cremilda McKenzie. Please call the absent members.
DeSaulnier? Aye. DeSaulnier, aye. Fuller? Aye. Fuller, aye. Kehoe? Liu? Aye. Liu, aye.
All right. We will hold that open for Senator Kehoe. And SB 66, the motion is due pass. Senator Vargas, please call the absent members.
The vote is currently 5-0. DeSaulnier? Aye. DeSaulnier, aye. Kehoe? Aye. Kehoe, aye. Liu? Aye. Liu, aye. 9-0.
9-0. SB 66 is out. Please call the absent member for the committee rules.
Kehoe? Aye. Kehoe, aye. That's 9-0.
9-0. The committee rules are adopted. And number 2, to designate the committee assistants. Please call the absent member.
Kehoe? Aye. Kehoe, aye. 9-0.
9-0, and those committee assistants are so designated. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you all.